Welcome to a special presentation from Hometown Cable. We're reviewing the beginnings of the Plattsburgh North Stars, who are celebrating their 25th anniversary season this year. And we're particularly going to take interest and look back at the very beginning of the organization that has existed now for 25 years. Welcome to our special program. I'm Rob Knowles. I'm joined by a couple of coaches that were on the original staff. Earl Brunelle is to my left, Mike James is to my right. We want to thank the Comfort Inn, who allowed us to come here to film this program, the Comfort Inn in Plattsburgh. Thank them for allowing us to come in and film this program today, and we want to think back and pay tribute and honor some of those people that really got the Plattsburgh North Star organization rolling, and it's something now that has lasted for 25 years, and as we know in our world today, something that lasts 25 years has to be doing something right, and it's pretty special because I was looking back over a number of the teams that have been in the Empire Football League and some of the past opponents. And there's a lot of teams that no longer exist. So it is a tribute to the people that have sustained the organization over 25 years. But Mike and Earl, we want to focus on the very beginnings of the organization. And before we started, Calvin and I were talking about, I remembered a game in 1990, and a kind of an exhibition game that was played in Plattsburgh that, if memory is right, featured Glens Falls and Montreal. And it was kind of a trial run to see if there would be community support for the Empire Football League or that brand of football. And there was, based on my recollection, a pretty big crowd that was there, and it was very well received. And I think that paved the way and really gave a lot of people in the greater Plattsburgh area some motivation to say, okay, look, there is community support for this. Let's take the ball and run with it now, literally, and see if we can't get our program off the board. And that led to 1991 and the beginning of the organization. And if you guys could take me through the beginning steps of the Plattsburgh North Stars and how eventually it was put together so that there was a product on a football field.
Right. Were you, I don't remember, Earl, if you were contacted before I was or not. I did one of the interviews for the head coaching job. I don't know how many people that they interviewed. They could have interviewed everyone for all that I know. Then when Mr. Williams was nominated as the head coach, I thought he did an outstanding job with the people that he put together. And I don't think, unless they get a college team, I don't think they'll ever have a team with the coaching staff like this again. And we were blessed because we had kids from all over the country because of the Air Force Base. And at that time, Vermont didn't have a team. So we had a lot more kids available to us than they do today.
My recollection is that there was a board behind the program as well. Right. In addition, of course, you had the coaches that were on field, but there were people behind the scenes that were taking care of tickets and checking the finances and getting the uniforms and everything else. Some of the people that were behind the scenes, and then we'll talk about John Williams and then the staff that he put together as well. Any recollections about the people who perhaps were working behind the scenes to make this happen?
Well, Rob, I'm thinking back now, 25 years. My recollection as to how I got involved, Don Bainbridge, Gary Butler, and myself, we coached at Beekmantown Central, and we were pretty much getting to the age of retirement.
And you guys had been at Beekmantown for a long time, coaching high school football, very successfully.
Yeah, many years. And anyway, Don said to me that there was an organizational meeting for a semi-pro football program that they wanted to start for the Plattsburgh area. And the meeting was to be down in City Hall with the mayor and some other area coaches who at that time I didn't know who was going to be involved in it. And would I be interested in being one of the coaches? And if I did, go to the meeting that night. So I went to the meeting, and as I recall, the mayor ran the meeting. John Paris was there, who eventually became our general manager.
Rick Perry, Ernie McClatchy.
Yeah, right. There was, but they were
They
involved later on.
Yeah, okay.
Mac McClary is a name that I remember. Wasn't Mac involved from a PR standpoint?
Yes, Mac was very instrumental in the formation of the North Stars.
In the very beginning, as well as through the rest of his life. He always stayed very close to the program.
He was very instrumental.
And he passed away a few years ago, if memory is right.
And John Williams was at that meeting, and anyway, at that meeting, it was decided that we're going to try and push to have a North Star football program. And the fellow who took the lead on it, I would say at that point, was John Paris. And John was involved with, the negotiations for getting, the coaches together and other coaches and from the area. And we pulled together what I would consider all the top and best coaches in the area all came together because we wanted to see this program get off to a good start. And John did a great job of coordinating all the coaches from the different schools.
All getting all the personalities together.
Because we were rivals for so many years and knocked heads, but we all came together and we all worked together very, very well.
When he says the top coaches, at the time the Press Republican wrote an article and they were talking about the who's who of the North Country coaches. We had 11 coaches. 7 of them had been head coaches at one point. 4 of them at some point had been athletic directors. We had 3 offensive line coaches, 2 of which had been head coaches and an athletic director. So you had to put your egos aside to work together. And like he said, we used to compete against each other all the time, but we all got along and we all respected each other. And there's a lot of people that coach, and you know this, a lot of people will put the hat on and wear the whistle, and they serve a very important purpose. But there's a few that are very respected and have longevity, as you said, and those were the ones that were on his staff. And we used to compete, believe me. I wanted to beat him, he wanted to beat me. But
because I coached him.
And we won't bring up how you guys got the 5 plays that one.
That never happened.
No, but we all put the egos aside and everybody worked together. We wanted to get this thing off and running.
And the guy who was the center point was John Williams, who was the head
Absolutely.
coach. And he had to establish an environment where everybody was going to work together to see this through for the betterment of the team. Talk about John Williams and your recollections of his presence. I believe it was the first couple of seasons that he served as the head coach of the North Stars.
John was probably the best person in the whole area they could have chosen to do that job. John's personality and the way he worked with men was, he just had that personality where you wanted to work for him. You wanted to listen to him. You wanted to be working with him. And that was our ace in the hole, was John. And the thing that I liked about John, he was the boss. He was the head coach, but he let us do our thing. Like, I was the defensive coordinator, and he just simply said to me, "Earl, put the defense together. It's your baby." And he kind of I went out and
you did your thing.
I scraped up a defense that we used like 25 years ago in high school because we didn't really know what we were going to have for kids, and plus the way practices were going to be. You got men that are working. Sometimes they could be at practice, sometimes they can't. So you can't put something together that's going to be very sophisticated. And I had a very simple way of coaching, actually, defense. Even in all the years we were very successful, it's called KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. And that's the kind of defense we had to put together, I felt, and that's what I did. I took an old high school defense. It was a slanting 50, something that was very successful for us at the high school level many years ago, and put that in at the semi-pro level, and we competed with that. And I even showed that defense to the Russians before we played them. And but anyway, John was that kind of a guy, and he was our leader, but he let us do our thing. And I couldn't be any more supportive of a head coach than John Williams.
Once again, we're talking the beginnings of the Plattsburgh North Stars, talking football on Hometown Cable. Mike, your reflections of Coach Williams?
Coach Williams was the head coach when I was at Plattsburgh State. I didn't get to play with him because I ripped out my ankle the year that he was the coach. So I played the following year for Dale Sprague. But the funny thing was, when I went to talk to Mr. Williams, he said, well, it's okay, you were too small to play for me anyway. And then I ended up playing for him later on.
Sure.
But he was just a great guy. He was a really good guy. And like Earl said, he was in charge, but this is your group, you run your group. And I never heard him chastise anyone. If he talked to people, he talked to them off to the side, because we never heard him chastise anyone.
And that certainly is a key in leadership. You have to trust in the abilities of the people that
Right.
are working underneath
Right.
you, and not micromanage.
And he was very smart, because the people that he picked, he chose some pretty good people.
Sure.
And so he could let them run.
And that's where we'll go next. We'll talk about some of the other gentlemen that you worked with, and some of the
Right.
other coaches that were also on the staff, some of whom have passed away, unfortunately,
Right.
but well, I'll get your recollections of those guys as well. But one of the guys that was on the staff, and I would guess was probably working alongside you on the defensive side, who coached at St. John's forever, and then over at Seton Catholic later on, was Gary Ryan.
Right.
Yep, Gary and I worked together in changing this defense so that we could very easily jump from a 5 front to an even front, which is simply called a 4-4. Gary gave me some good ideas on that. And Dutch Cromer, who I worked with at Plattsburgh High School for a while, and sad to say we lost Dutch a few years ago, but Dutch was also very influential in some of the things that we did defensively.
Yeah, longtime coach and administrator in the Plattsburgh City School District,
Right.
coached at PHS for a number of years.
Just a great man. And Jimmy Godfrey, I'm the one that really got Jimmy Godfrey into coaching.
Mhm.
And he used to come to my house at night and pick my brain, which isn't very big, for everything that I could do to help him be a good football coach.
And he's still involved.
And when I finally did retire and got out of football coaching, I took everything that I had on defensive materials that I had accumulated for 30 years, and I gave it all to Jimmy.
Mhm.
And you would think I had given him the the whole state of New York, honest to God. But anyway, Jimmy just did a tremendous job for us also.
Right, and he has worked at Peru in past years. I believe currently on the staff at Plattsburgh High School,
He is.
trying to get that program pointed in the right direction, and they seem to be making strides.
And
Currently.
he had some experience in this league. He had been an all-star in this league
Player.
as a player.
Mhm.
So we wanted to tap into that as well. And he's a great guy.
Sure.
And then another guy that we worked well with was a man from the Air Force Base. His name was Jim Parks.
Right.
Jimmy worked with my linebackers.
Mhm.
And at first, Jimmy was inexperienced, but were willing to learn. You know, he would listen to my suggestions for drills and you know, what you look for in a linebacker, and Jimmy did a pretty good job there. Gary Fassett worked with my secondary, and eventually ended up playing in the secondary. I knew when we tapped into Gary Fassett as a coach that he'd end up playing. I knew that because I coached Gary in high school.
And one of the funny things about that is Gary was a coach, and he's a year older than I am, so he was probably 10 or 11 years older than the players. And we had a series of drills that they had to do to try out for the team. We had tryouts back then.
Mhm.
So they had to do a mile run, and they had to do 40-yard sprints and bench presses and things. So when they did their mile run, Gary went out and beat them. I think he beat everybody but one or two kids. And here he is, like
On the
11 years
coaching
older.
staff. Right. Well, he was
Yeah.
obviously in phenomenal shape.
Yeah, he was in good shape, but we had a lot, and you mentioned something, and I wanted to get back to your point as well, when you were asking me about the group of people, because there are so many people in the background that you can't think of everyone to compliment them. But the ladies from the Air Force Base, they were our trainers,
Mm-hmm.
and they would go to every game and do the training job, and that's a huge thing, especially when guys are getting beat up, and it takes a lot of work.
And of course, on those early teams, when Plattsburgh Air Force Base was still open, some of the key players that were on the early North Star teams, and we'll get into players in a
Right,
second. I
right.
don't want to go in that direction just yet.
Right.
But some of those key players were enlisted servicemen, and they were working football into the busy schedule that they already
Absolutely.
had. And that's where I'd like to go next. You talked about, of course, when you're coaching high school football, it's kind of a captive audience. The bell
Right.
rings at 3 o'clock, the school day's done, you go out on the football
Right.
field and you
Right.
practice. But now that you're dealing with men that are, 21, 31, somewhere in that age range typically, years old, they have professional careers that they're working with, and they have to manage work, maybe a family, and playing football. That had to have been a difficult balancing act for coaches and players to sometimes take all of the different factors into consideration in trying to put a program together.
There's life, and that's what Earl was saying, you need to keep it simple. When we played the season, my dad died in the middle of that season. Everybody's got things going on, but like you said, they were men. And most of the games were very clean because people understood that. This guy's got to go to work
Mhm.
the next day. So the ball games were very cleanly played, I would say,
Yeah.
for the most part.
Because the guy you're playing against is in the same boat you are.
Sure.
He's got to go to work on Monday with his lunch pail. So the cutting at the line of scrimmage and stuff like that was to a very, very low minimum.
Sure. Well, you understand too, like you look at the average length of a professional National Football League player's career,
Right.
relatively short. And that's one thing that I've always wondered. You see the rosters will often turn over for the North Stars. And it's good that there's usually a fresh crop of kids coming out of high school that still have interest in continuing to play football. But the risk factor that is involved, it's a high impact, high intensity
Well,
sport,
and you have to-
and injuries happen.
You have to remember, back then, we played a lot of the taxi squad guys from the Rough Riders, the Argonauts, the Alouettes.
Canadian Football
The
League team.
Canadian football guys, and then the USFL had just disbanded.
Mhm.
So we had guys that were still able to play from that league. There was quite a variety of talent.
In fact, I can remember the quarterback from Montreal, when we played
Right.
Montreal.
Right.
He was a professional player up there. His name was Flynn. And he just, as a defensive coordinator, he drove me crazy.
Mm.
Because if you kept him contained, he'd kill you with his arms.
Sure.
And then if you put the heat on him, his feet were so
He'd get
quick.
outside.
Oh, he was a bullet. And
Next thing you know, he's going down the sideline
and
for
the
20
one
yards.
game that we really gave him a game, we had a kid by the name of Tommy Wilder who could have been a Division I player.
Mhm.
And took Tommy from the offense, put him on the defense just to spy on this quarterback, because he's the only kid that we had on our team that could run with him.
Sure.
So, yeah, we played some really good kids. I can remember in Scranton, we played two kids that had just been cut by the Dallas Cowboys. We played in Toronto, and not Toronto, Ottawa.
Mhm.
And I was told by a newspaper man before the game that 4 or 5 of their players had played in a Rough Riders game a few weeks before.
Sure.
So we're playing pros, and we're basically our team. We did have, like you said, some good players from the base, and most of our bulk of our players though were local athletes from the area.
Mhm.
So here we got great high school players and a few good college prospects. We were knocking horns with pros
Sure.
quite often.
Let's go back to some of the other guys that were also on
Right.
on the coaching staff with you. Another gentleman who coached at St. John's and in Seton for a number of years, Larry Carpenter, was also on the staff. Your recollections of Larry and his coaching style?
Larry and Gary Ryan, we would play against them when they were at St. John's and when they were at Seton as well. And we would go at it as coaches, but afterwards we'd meet over at Miron's and have an adult beverage, and we were friends again. But when we were on the field, we were banging heads. But often they came and practiced with our team. We worked together. And like I said, there was a mutual respect amongst this group. Before John had put the staff together, there was a mutual respect amongst everybody. I played for Earl Brunelle.
Mm-hmm.
I played for Gary Butler, Don Bainbridge. I respect them. Gary Pizzette's the same way. And he's talking about the guys that he coached that became coaches. I have kids that I coached that had became head coaches. So you try and pass it on, and it just makes you feel good. Like you achieve something.
Sure. Coach, recollections of Larry?
Larry was the type coach that I call silent but deadly.
Right.
You never knew. Larry wasn't the yell type, he's screaming his head off or anything like that.
Very reserved.
But his knowledge of football was greatly in depth.
Mm-hmm.
Had a great knowledge of the game, but knew how to teach.
Mm-hmm.
And was able to communicate with kids. That's the key to coaching. You can have all the X's and O's up here, but if you can't teach to kids, you're not going to be successful.
Sure.
So when you talk about successful coaches, you're talking about great teachers. And I never coached at the pro level, but pros is the same deal.
Sure.
If you're not a great teacher, you're not going to have a great team.
Yeah.
I'll tell you that. I don't care what level it's at.
I remember back when Coach Carpenter and Ryan were working with St. John's or Seton, they would often have some of the smallest squads because they didn't have large populations school-wise. And they'd always take their 1, 2, 3, or 4 really good players, and they would always be in the right place at the right time, and they would find a way to be competitive. And I think about, not to get too far off topic, but I think about Mariah these days, or Ticonderoga these days, and how they always find a way to get their top 5 or 6 or 10 guys, whatever it might be, and they're always right involved in the middle of the game plan.
Some of these guys that aren't here, I want to give them credit for what they achieved, because when we were talking about when John put the staff together and people had to put their egos aside, Gary Ryan was in the New York State Hall of Fame for coaching. He had been an athletic director. Larry had been an athletic director. They were head coaches. You're going to see this as we go down the list. Some of these people have amazing resumes, but they put it aside to come together and make this a success.
And you talked earlier about some of the other guys from Beekmantown that came along with you to this staff, and Coach Gary Butler was another guy, and you also mentioned Don Bainbridge earlier, who was the head coach at Beekmantown for a number of years that you were working with.
Don was the most organized coach I've ever seen at any level. That's one of the reasons why we were very, very successful at Beekmantown Central, is because of the organizational skills and the way Don could teach the game of football. Gary Butler, I consider not only one of my best friends, but his knowledge of offensive line play is second to none. In fact, I can remember one of our football teams that he put together as a line. These kids have been together for like 4 years, and I had never seen this done at the high school level.
I know where he's going.
But we've had a team, well, actually, these kids went undefeated for 2.5 years. These kids at the high school level, depending on the play, could come to the line of scrimmage. I don't care what you did defensively. These kids made all the adjustment calls at the line of scrimmage. So no matter what you did defensively, you wanted to blitz or you wanted to, whatever you wanted to do over there, these kids got good enough through Gary's coaching that they would make all the calls right at the line of scrimmage.
Sure.
For every play. I'm not just talking 1 or 2. These kids could do it for every play. And you don't see that even at the college level.
Sure.
And these kids are doing this at the high school level. Gary, I considered the best offensive line coach in the area.
And not only football, baseball for a
Baseball.
number of years in Beekmantown. Gary Ryan was,
Right.
he's in the New York State High School Hockey Coaches Hall of
Right.
Fame. So many of the men that we're talking about were not only football coaches,
Oh,
but also
absolutely.
successful in a
Well,
number
Gary-
of other sports.
Gary Butler was also a scout for the Expos.
Yes.
And Don Bainbridge, at one time, was the New York State High School Coach of the Year.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Mr. Butler used to have a saying, if you hustle on every play, sometimes you surprise even yourself. And that was a true statement. And one of the things that he did for us, I was coaching at a different school, and he was one of the speakers because we wanted to try and make our program like theirs, which was very successful. And he came and spoke, and I didn't realize he was going to do this. And he was talking about when I had played for him and hustling and doing the extra things. And that meant a great deal to me because of the man,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Not many people know this, but for years, we used to go to a big football clinic in Binghamton, New
Right.
York.
Mm-hmm.
And they bring in the top college coaches from all over the country there. I've heard the best, John McKay, the list goes on and
Sure.
on. The best, they choose one high school football coach to also speak at that clinic. Don Baybridge from Beekmantown Central School 1 year was selected as the speaker for every high school coach in New York State that year at the Binghamton Clinic.
And that was a statewide event.
Yeah, there's 2,000
There was coaches
Yeah.
from all over the country,
There's
actually.
2,000 coaches sitting there that you're talking your football program to.
Sure.
And, you know, going through your plays and showing them the films and stuff of your game. In fact, we had coaches come up to us and said, you doctored that film, those are not high school lines. And because at that time we were running the Delaware wing tee,
Mhm.
which we got out of the University of Delaware, and we ran it exactly the way the University of Delaware ran it. And we had college coaches saying that we had doctored the film.
And back then you were using film. It's not like today where they have all these, high-tech things that you could probably use to doctor stuff up.
And the film was not doctored. These high school kids executing the Delaware wing tee.
Back then it would have been scissors and tape to try to doctor film. So we're talking about the Plattsburgh North Stars, the beginning of the North Stars program, 25-year anniversary season. This season, 2016, for the North Stars. We've talked about the various guys that were on the coaching staff, and when we come back in a second, we're going to talk about getting the product out on the field and maybe some of the first games of the
There's
season.
a couple more guys. Did we mention Art LaMarche?
We didn't.
Yeah, Art LaMarche and Dutch Cromer. I think we mentioned Dutch a
Yeah.
little bit.
Yep,
But
talk about Art LaMarche.
I first met Art when I was doing my student teaching. And at that time, he was an assistant principal and a second grade teacher.
Mm.
And then he became a head coach for the swimming team, I believe,
At Plattsburgh.
at Plattsburgh, yeah. But Art worked with our offensive line, with Gary, with Mr. Butler.
And on the coaching staff, a lot of guys that were similar age-wise,
Right.
and guys that had a lot of respect for one another. That's the common theme that I'm hearing from both of you guys, how much you guys seem to A, enjoy working together, and B, respect one another.
Art LaMarche was my best friend. We grew up together as kids. We competed against each other in high school. I played for Beekmantown Central, and Art played for MEI.
Mm-hmm.
And Art was an outstanding athlete and worked with John Williams at Plattsburgh State, working with the running backs.
Mm-hmm.
And I know John or Art worked with Don Bainbridge in the offensive backfield with the North Stars.
Oh, okay. I thought he was working with Gary.
No,
Okay,
he
I
worked in the
apologize.
backfield.
I apologize. But
Art
Dutch,
was one of the
Dutch
greatest
worked
running
with Gary
backs
then.
ever played football in this area.
Right.
Yeah, Art
Yeah.
was a tremendous football player.
Well, I remember that one game. Didn't he score all the points in the game or something? Wasn't that Art?
Possibly.
I think there was one high school game where he scored every point for his team.
Yeah.
You know, so.
All right.
All right.
Any other thoughts on the coaches? I think
It was a
We
great
pretty
group.
much covered them all.
It was a great group. I mean, the only guy that we didn't have in there would have been Johnny Raymond. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
other than that, I think we pretty much covered
Sure.
every high school, the best coaches that were out there at the
You
time.
know, Rob, you were mentioning about the successful coaches that are down in Ty now and at Mariah, and I don't care where you look at the level of high school coaching today. You go back and you got your Barry Brannon, Jerry Levine at Seton Catholic, and back then it was St. John's, who passed on all their knowledge
Sure.
and skills and everything, and now then Larry Carpenter stepped right into their shoes and continued it. Down in Mariah, you had Joe Gilbo, and that staff that he had together for years, and they were very, very successful. And they passed on all their knowledge and stuff to their kids, and now those kids,
Sure.
Tizar, I believe, is
Yep.
the coach down there. They're doing very, very well.
It's
And
the tree growing roots.
Exactly, that's what it is.
So we're talking again about the Plattsburgh North Stars and their beginnings back in 1991. We're going to talk about some of the early games that the North Stars played. We'll also talk about some of the players that were on those original teams. We'll get to that and more when this special presentation on Hometown Cable about the Plattsburgh North Stars continues right after this. Once again, we want to thank the staff here at the Comfort Inn for hosting us this afternoon as we're reminiscing about the 1991 Plattsburgh North Stars football season. That was their first season in operation as they celebrate their 25th season in 2016. Mike James to my right, Earl Brunelle to my left. They were both coaches on the staff. And Mike, we kind of left you out of the discussion about the coaches, and we heard about the background of some of the other coaches that were on, all of the other coaches that were on the staff, so we don't want to leave you out of things.
Right.
Tell us about your background in coaching, and I know you were telling me earlier you started as a coach with the North Stars and then eventually ended up playing as well.
I did at the end of the season, and when we discuss the players, we'll talk about the reason why. But as far as the coaching, I had played for Mr. Brunelle, Mr. Bambridge, Mr. Butler when I was in high school. I went on to play at Plattsburgh State. When they cut the football team at Plattsburgh State, I went to coach with those guys over at Beamantown. And that's where I learned how to coach, was from those folks. I later coached at MAI with Kevin Rock, and I coached at PHS, and I enjoyed every experience. But as I said, when we worked together, we got along, and when we competed, we got along. But we really competed hard. And Earl will tell you, if they played against a team that I was coaching, they knew they were going to be in for a game, and they were going to be taking some hits. And we had a blast. And they beat us most of the time, but we let them know they were in a ball game.
I'm guessing that you and probably Jim Godfrey were the youngest guys on this staff.
No, Gary Fizzette and I were the youngest.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah, Jimmy had just finished up his career. He had been an all-star, and he finished up. And then
Where had he played?
he played in Water? Was it Water?
Green Jacket.
Green Jacket. He played for the Green Jackets.
Glens Falls.
Glens
Glens
Falls.
Falls.
Yeah. Yeah. And Jimmy was the same way as the rest of us. I mean, we used to do go-karts when I was younger, and the go-karts could fit maybe 3 or 4 go-karts around the track, but there'd be 4 or 5 of us trying to come around the corner, and nobody was backing out. Nobody was backing down.
So as the young guys, they didn't make you go get the coffee, did they?
No, they treated us okay. It wasn't like the high school where the young guys have to do the weight room every weekend. No, that was the thing. Now, see, it's interesting that you said that, because that goes back to our earlier topic. I coached the defensive ends, I coached the punt return guys. Earl gave me complete discretion as to what I wanted to do. If I wanted to call a punt block, or return right, left, whatever. He never interfered with what I was doing. And Mr. Williams never did. He would come and watch my group. That's what John would do. He would go around and watch the different groups as they were working. But they never interfered.
Sure.
Ever. He had confidence in me. That's why he asked me to do what I was doing.
And that was the level of trust that people had in one
and
another.
John Williams had confidence in him. That's why he asked him to do his position. So it worked well. It worked really well. And you wouldn't think that guys, because when you're in this profession, believe me, they all have big egos. I mean, you're competitive. You want to win. But everybody just put that aside. It was great. It was great. It worked together very well.
And in the beginning, I don't know if it's changed since, but I'm guessing there wasn't much of a salary involved for anybody on this coaching staff.
No.
No.
Yeah, so there was, I'm going to guess there probably was almost no money being exchanged for any of the coaches.
No money involved.
Yeah. So when it was time to travel places,
Right.
the gas tank and the monies that you had to put in, that was for the love of the game, that everybody was involved trying to help point this program in the right direction.
And you'll see when we talk about the players, the same thing goes with the players. Because you had, as he said, we had some very good high school players.
Mm-hmm.
We also had all the guys from Vermont. Vermont didn't have a team then. We had a couple guys from Montreal, and we had all the guys from the Air Force Base. So we had a running back from Georgia, a defensive end from Texas, a wide receiver from Michigan. But they played together well. It was just one of those teams that comes along and everybody gets along and works hard.
Sure.
And it worked.
And sometimes that can be a challenge, to get all the personalities in the room
Absolutely.
to work together, especially if they're coming from a variety of backgrounds.
Absolutely.
That is.
So let's talk about, we've got the coaching staff assembled, and we've been practicing. It's the 1991 season, and all of a sudden it's time to go and play. And if my memory is right, was the first actual event, was it an exhibition game?
I'm not sure, Mike. Did they call it next? I know it was on the schedule. Our first
Was
game.
that did we play the Russians the first game?
No, first game we played was Toronto.
Oh, okay.
I'll never forget that because
Was that in Plattsburgh or
Yeah.
it
in
was in
Ontario?
Plattsburgh.
No,
They had
it
some
was-
big boys.
it was in Plattsburgh. After we had gone out and loosened up, and anyway, they were a little late getting to the field. They put on their uniforms and everything out on their bus, and the gates open, and I look, and here comes the Oakland Raiders. Oakland helmets, jerseys, pants. I swore it was the Oakland Raiders, and they were as big, if not bigger. And they come walking across the field to their sideline, and I ran and I found our general manager, John Paris. And I was mad. I said, John, what are you
heck?
doing? I said, this is our first game, and you're making us play a team that could probably sub for the Oakland Raiders.
Sure.
So they're looking at the size of those men. And he said, Earl, he said, we can compete with them. I wasn't sure we could compete with those guys. And anyway, make a long story short, when we introduced our players, we introduced Toronto first, and then we introduced our players. We had a player by the name of Todd Lauren, and I don't know if you remember Todd as an athlete, but Todd was a great hockey player. He was a goalie.
Was a goalie in hockey, yeah.
And Todd was about as wide as he was high. But to look at him, you would think he was no athlete at all.
Sure.
But Todd Lauren was a real athlete. Well, anyway, we introduced Todd, and Todd at that time probably went 270 and was probably 5'5". And Todd runs out on the field, and we look across, and Toronto's all laughing at him over there.
Not a prototypical lineman body.
No, not a lineman's body. And Todd was our nose guard.
Mhm.
And anyway, game starts. We had to kick off to them, and they had the ball first. And the first snap of the ball, the quarterback takes, and he goes back to hand the ball off to a running back. And just as he hands the ball off to a running back, you hear this whack, and this guy flat in his back. There's Todd Lauren staring at him, right? Well, nothing was said. Todd goes back to his spot. Kid gets up. Anyway, they come out of the huddle. Anyway, they come to the line of scrimmage, snap the ball for the second play. Quarterback goes to hand the ball off. Whack! Guy gets hit flat in his back. There's Todd Lauren.
2 for 2.
2 for 2. All of a sudden, they were screaming, "Will somebody block that guy?"
You might have been generous too when you said 275.
Yeah,
You might have been pushing a little more than that.
But anyway, no more laughing at Todd.
Right.
I remember that very explicitly.
One of my images that I'm getting now, just thinking back to, I can imagine him being announced and running out onto the field. And I think running may not be the right term to use. It's kind of waddling out
shuffled.
there, to line up with everybody
Well,
else.
let's just say this.
Quick as a cat.
Yes, yes.
If they had an all Madden team for semi-pros, he's on it.
Todd would be on it.
And I don't believe Toronto was in the Empire League, so I think that probably
It
was
must
an
have been
exhibition game.
Could have been.
Because they had taxi squad guys from the Argonauts on that team, so.
And at that time, most of the Empire League teams were in New York or in Pennsylvania,
Right.
if I remember in back in the early 1990s.
Right, we played like Watertown, Glens Falls.
But we did beat them.
And that's why you would go to John Paris and say, "What are you doing scheduling these guys? They're ready to clobber
Our
us."
first
Right.
game.
Right. So you ended up winning that exhibition.
We did.
And everybody must have been feeling pretty good, right out, fresh out of the gun. We're ready to do something positive, and you get a victory in the exhibition. And then, I don't remember specifically. Do you remember what the crowd was like for that
Oh.
first exhibition?
We had a big crowd.
Yeah.
It was very, very big.
Yeah.
So the community support was there, and
We
that,
did have
tremendous
that. We
support.
did have that, yeah.
and that had been gauged.
And I think it was a novelty too at the
Sure.
time.
Yeah. And that had been gauged again with a game that had been played in 1990 that didn't
Right.
feature Plattsburgh yet, where there was a good turnout for that. So the crowd showed up for the first exhibition, and then the second exhibition was a real event, and you brought some of the paraphernalia that you were forced to wear in that game. But tell me about exhibition number 2, which was against. You don't typically think of Russia as being adept in football, and based on the final score of that game, they weren't very adept, but they were there to learn.
Right.
And you think about contextually, historically at that time, we're talking 1991.
We were the first
The end of the
team
Cold
to ever
War?
play against the Russians.
Sure.
Right.
So that was kind of a neat event with the Air
Right.
Force Base and the people that were on the team and what was going on historically at the time. Plattsburgh plays against a team from Moscow.
The Moscow Swans.
Yep.
A daunting name for a football team.
But John Paris mentioned that we would be playing the Russians. Of course, John was a salesman. He could sell lace to Eskimos. And but anyway, at first, when he first told us that we were going to play the Russians, I thought, he's just feeding us a line.
Sure.
Well, next thing you know, I mean, all the pieces came together, and the Russian team appears. We meet them the first time the team arrives. Our coaching staff was asked to present a little of our knowledge to their team because they had Olympic athletes on that team. Athletes, we could not even match up with them because
Sure.
they had Olympic players, track people, hammer throwers, weightlifters, but had never played football. At that point, I didn't know how much knowledge in football they had.
Mhm.
All I knew that this was a Russian football team. So here we are, we're in this building right here, and big room down here, and I'm diagramming defenses and showing slanting defenses. At one point, finally, I stopped, and I said to John Williams, I said, "We're playing these guys in 2 days. How much of this stuff do I show them?" He says, "Show them everything." So I did. I gave them quite a bit of knowledge that I had.
And what was your impression of how much they
Oh.
arrived in Plattsburgh with? Minimal?
Minimal.
Yeah.
Very, very
And
minimal.
their equipment was
Oh,
minimal.
well, anyway, make a long story short, again, I have 2 of the players come to live with me for that week.
Mm-hmm.
Sergei Mashalenko, who I still in contact
No
with,
kidding.
and Oleg Podiolka, his name was. Those 2 kids stayed with me. And I'll never forget the first night they came to our house. My sister and I lived side by side.
Mhm.
My sister was putting on a little meal for them, and so we had family there. And Sergey comes in, and he's got it. They got their football equipment with them. Well, anyway, they put their bags down, and he reaches in and he takes out a bottle of vodka, and he uncaps it, and he asked, well, he couldn't speak English and we couldn't speak Russian. We did everything with pantomime, miming. So we gave him some glasses, he poured, and just a little sip for everybody, and he pointed and said, "Friends." And we really, at that point, didn't know the depth of what he was saying. Because later on, when he realized that we were not his enemy, because his mother begged him not to come to the United States, because she told him that if he came to the United States, he'd never come back alive.
Right.
That's how indoctrinated those people were, that we were going to kill them. And he, once he realized, I took him to the mall, and I took him to where there was a supermarket. You know, he couldn't believe the way we lived.
Sure.
And he said that night that we had the drink, after he said "friends," he pointed to the little kids that were around the room, and he said, "No war." And he repeated it about 3 times, "No war." Because again, these people had been indoctrinated that the United States only wanted to kill them. And I didn't realize that at that point, the level of hatred, or I won't call it hatred, I call it more fear that they had of us.
Sure.
And
at that's July, right? We're talking July, probably 1991.
Yeah, because there was the 4th of July.
And the Soviet Union would collapse
Right,
later in the fall.
because we were
and
supposed
winter.
to actually go there the following year, and then we couldn't.
Yeah.
The wall came
I would
down.
imagine someone, you talked about however they pulled this off, there must have been a lot of dealing going on behind the scenes through the government to get them here in the first place.
Absolutely. And some of those guys were big, big men. They were scared to death of that one lady in particular, because she was
Well,
KGB.
Oh, okay.
There was 2 KGB agents.
That traveled with
because-
them.
Yeah, because
They didn't want defections.
Sure.
they had all their pictures in the paper. I don't know if you remember that back then, but they had the team picture. And anyway, I got the paper and I put it out on the table, and Oleg and Sergey were looking at it, and Sergey leaned over like that, and he pointed to 2 different ones, and he says, "KGB, KGB," and then he went. He hated the KGB. Yeah.
So the Press Republican had like a big spread for the game.
Yeah, a
Right.
big story.
And when those guys stayed, they stayed with us for a week. They would get up every morning, do their road work. They were really hard workers. But the thing that struck, there was a couple of things. The fear that they had of that little lady who was half their size at best. And then I remember the guys from the Comfort Inn talking about how they couldn't keep enough bread and butter on the table because these guys didn't have that.
Sure.
And so they were just eating as much as they could. They were overwhelmed. They thought we were the richest country going. And I remember the one guy, I can't remember if he was a sprinter or what he was. He was an Olympic athlete. And he made a bunch of X's on a piece of paper, and then he went, "My house." And it was a small square. But they were so impressed that people had cars and the roads are paved and that sort of thing. And in passing, I'll tell you this, don't ever make the mistake that I made and try and drink vodka with those guys. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. They drink it like it's soda.
Yeah. At
It's
that time,
unbelievable.
Gorbachev was the last communist leader of the Soviet Union, and they had gone through a policy of openness, glasnost,
Right.
which encouraged the exchanges between the United States and Soviet Union. And really, in the end, what it was doing was paving the way for the end of communism. As
Right.
people like this team traveled to Plattsburgh and started to see
Yeah.
that their impressions that had been ingrained in their brains, they had been brainwashed to think about this evil country, and now all of a sudden
Well, the other
they're
thing,
going back home with different attitudes.
I don't know if you remember back then, but somebody had made a film trying to disparage the United States and show all these poverty-stricken places. And then they showed it in Russia. But it backfired because the poverty-stricken places here were much better than what they had over there.
Yeah.
So it totally backfired because like, oh really, that's the worst they have? That's much better than what we have.
Sure. Now, if my memory is right, I think the game was played
Yeah.
right around the 4th of July. Was
It
it
was.
played on the 4th?
I believe it was played on the 4th. And I found these have been down in my cellar for 30 years.
Come on, I saw you in the grocery store last week with those on.
Anyway, all the coaches had to wear those pants on the 4th of July. That's what we wore. Now, my waist, compared to what I was in 1991, these just about fit on my arm.
How excited were you to put those things on?
Not excited.
Tell me that they made the other coaches wear them too.
Everybody.
Will Gary Ryan put these on?
Gary Ryan.
Come on.
Everyone.
Larry Carpenter put them on. Everybody.
Yeah.
When we said you had to put your egos aside,
Yeah.
this was the indoctrination.
And I'm going to guess this was a John Paris idea.
It was. That could be done.
Oh, yeah. And everybody was probably delighted when he brought those in the room for everybody.
And then to continue a little story about the Russian kids, Sergey. I don't know. To this day, I still don't know. Well, there's two stories that are really funny. One, I have a four-wheeler. I'm a hunter, so I got a four-wheeler.
Mm-hmm.
And my brother, who lives next to me, also has a four-wheeler. So we were letting the Russian kids run our four-wheelers around the field.
Sure.
So anyway, they were running around the field with the four-wheelers. So I went in the house to take a shower. And I came out, and my nephew was there. And he said, Uncle Earl, he said, do you know that the Russian kids have got the four-wheelers? I said, yes. I said, Uncle Red and I are letting them ride them around on the farm here. He said, yeah. He said, you know where they are right now? I said, no, where are they? He said, they're racing up and down Route 3. They went down Route 3 and they were racing.
No.
Imagine this trooper pulling them over.
For reference, Route 3 isn't that far from your house. But to make it to Route 3, a four-lane highway from your house, right? Not far away, a four-lane highway. But, and what happened? Did they get back home before anything?
Yeah, they got
Yeah.
They didn't get arrested. And then that night we had a get-together here at the Comfort Inn, a little banquet for them.
Was this their headquarters? This is where they were
This
based?
is where they stayed. And my brother has a Cadillac. And anyway, we get home, and the next thing we know, here comes Sergey up the road, driving my brother's Cadillac.
Well, the story. Oh, go ahead, Ro.
No, it's just that when those kids left to go back, I'll never forget this as long as I live, because they got on a bus right out here outside the Comfort Inn.
Mm-hmm.
Those two kids were in the window, right, saying goodbye to me, and they were both crying like babies.
They had such a good experience and a good time here.
Well, Oleg had gotten married the day they made him. They forced him onto a plane to fly over here to play that game.
Wow.
Yeah, he had no choice.
And you said you're still in touch with him?
Oh, not Oleg, Sergey.
Okay.
I am.
And what has he gone on to do in life?
Right now, he's fighting the Russians in the Ukraine.
Huh?
Yeah, that's what he's doing right now, as we speak.
You think that was instilled by your four-wheeler trip on Route 3?
No, he was in the special forces in the Soviet Union.
Okay.
He had fought in Afghanistan before,
But originally Ukrainian.
he was originally Ukrainian, right? From Kiev, I believe.
Sure.
Now the one thing, they also made that same sign whenever they talked about Saddam Hussein. Whenever his name came up, they'd all go Saddam, and they meant it. They weren't kidding.
Yeah. And right around that time, Saddam
Right.
was aggressively moving towards Kuwait.
Right.
And then before they left, they had brought some stuff that they wanted to trade.
We did a lot of exchanging.
Trading. He gave me a watch. To be honest with you, I can't tell you the value of that watch, because we got to remember now, this is before the breakup of the Soviet Union. He gave me a watch that has a picture of Gorbachev with the Russian flag,
Mm-hmm.
and I believe it's George Bush, the older,
Right.
in the face of the watch with the American flag, both of them, and everything else in the box is Russian. And he gave me that.
Sure. Nice.
Yeah.
Now, the one story I want to pass on about the Russians is when they were working with us, we do drills with them. They stayed with us for a week. It was a week, right?
Yeah.
So we're doing a drill, and I'm standing here like this. We do the drill, and I have to call the little KGB lady over to translate and tell this guy, who is a huge gorilla, please tell him this is a no-contact drill.
Right.
He almost broke my ribs. he was a weightlifter. I mean, this guy was huge. He almost broke my ribs. I'm just standing there, and all of a sudden, you know, it was like, please tell him this is a no-contact
Sure.
drill. And then he's like, sorry. Too late.
So the cultural exchange
Yeah.
kind of overshadows the actual
It
game.
did.
And that's the lifelong impression. You remember more about that week, spending it with
Oh,
those
absolutely.
players, than
Than the
probably the
actual
game
game.
itself.
Because we started subbing right away
Yeah.
in that game.
They were, you know, the score, we could have made the score anything we want.
Sure.
You know,
Right.
we were playing kids that didn't even know when to punt the ball.
Mhm.
You know, so as far as the game itself, that's very insignificant,
Mhm.
because I know I was subbing second, third team players in the first quarter, because we wanted to keep the team, or keep the score down as much as we could. You know,
Right.
we didn't want to rub their noses in it,
Sure.
because you know, it would have made bad feelings,
Mhm.
and there was no need for it, because they were good kids.
But
They
even-
weren't any different than our kids.
Having said that, we still got some criticism from people because we beat them 43-0.
Right.
And people are like, well, why did you run up the score? We didn't run up the score. Believe me, we tried to do
Could have been a lot
everything
worse.
We
to
did.
not run up the score.
Yeah, we did
But you
everything we
can't
could.
send a kid in to play and tell him not to score.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, we're sending in substitutions, but we're going to allow them to play.
So you played a game against Toronto in an exhibition. You played a game against Moscow in an exhibition. It's tough to top those two games. You haven't even started your regular season yet.
I think the first four were 4-0, I believe.
And so were there more exhibitions after those two games?
Ottawa, when did Ottawa come into this?
Ottawa, I think, was later on, and was actually.
And Montreal was later on, because that's when
League.
Gary got hurt.
League game.
Montreal was in the league. I think
Right.
Ottawa had a league
I
team
think
as well
Ottawa
at the
was,
beginning.
And the Watertown Red and Black.
Yeah, that was a league opponent.
Yeah, and then we
Glens
had
Falls
Glens
was-
Glens
Falls,
Falls.
and then we played Scranton afterwards in the
Yeah.
playoff.
And they
That was
were
the
in the
playoff
league, but I
game.
think the league was big enough at that time. There was like a north and a south.
Yes.
Right.
There was-
And was there a team in Syracuse? I wonder if at that time
I know there was one in Newbury. because-
you had to go there.
No, they came here. They introduced us to the football in that league.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, there's got to be a story there.
Well, they had a lot of college players, like out of Montclair State.
Mhm.
You know, they had a lot of college players, and they were still young and good. They spanked us pretty good.
Right.
So they put our heads back into our shoulder pads.
So I don't recall what was the final record for the first season.
It was
wins
a
and
winning
losses.
record. It was,
Yeah, I don't remember.
it was
We had made the
probably
playoffs.
six- yeah,
Right.
Probably 6-4 or 5-5.
And we won actually a couple of games in the playoffs, right? Then we won the first one, then we went on to Scranton, or I don't remember.
Yeah, well, the playoff game against Scranton, we
A
had
lot of our
actually-
guys couldn't go.
Right.
Yeah, we had actually picked up our equipment and everything. It's the team that had finished ahead of us that was supposed to play, backed out. Probably because they knew Scranton was a great team.
Yes.
Because they ended up winning the Nationals that year.
Mhm.
And so we did. We went down to play them, but we probably shouldn't have, because, you know, we actually stopped in Albany, picked up a punter.
Right.
I mean, we were putting things together in order to have a team to play a team that won the Nationals. So needless to say, when we went down to Scranton, we got spanked. And, but I will say this, we haven't said much about players, but I think you were down there at the game.
Yes,
Rob.
yeah.
I had a kid by the name of Robin Vaughn that played for us. Robin played at Saranac Central, and I coached hundreds and hundreds of football players, and I consider Robin Vaughn the best high school football player I've ever coached. In that game in Scranton, I don't know if you remember the guy on the loudspeaker or not that was announcing the game said, "You want to watch a football player? Watch number 54 from Plattsburgh." And I believe 54 was Robin.
Right.
But no matter where the ball was, there was Robin Vaughn.
Well,
I bet you Robin had 25 tackles.
In that game, he was playing corner behind me because I was playing defensive end in that game. And we'll get into that.
Sure, we'll talk more about
When we
the
get into
players.
about the players.
What I remember about that game, first of all, I remember being impressed because it was played inside. Scranton Wilkes-Barre had a AAA affiliate at the time.
Yeah, that was a
I want to say
beautiful-
maybe with the Phillies.
That was a beautiful stadium.
Yeah, and I was
Artificial
filming that
turf.
game, so I had headsets on, so I'm not sure I would have heard the announcement from the PA. But I remember, look at this big stadium that the team is going to be playing in, and of course we had seen the scores and we had heard Scranton Wilkes-Barre had a team that was probably going to be difficult to beat. And my recollection is that after the first quarter, the game was already out the window.
It was lost against the Russians.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And that was the last game of the
Right,
season,
of that
of the
season.
inaugural
Yeah.
year. But in between the last game and the two exhibition games that we talked about, any other stories or impressions of some of those other
I
regular
don't
season games?
remember the games as much as when you start talking about the players and
Mhm.
things. That's what you remember.
Sure.
You remember the guys that you coach.
Yeah, and we'll get into that in our last segment.
But the actual games, I mean, they come and go after a while. You know, that you get them mixed up together. But
One game that I do particularly remember was Ottawa.
Mhm.
We were playing Ottawa up in Ottawa, and before the game, one of their newspaper writers, sports writers, came over to me and he said, "You guys know really who you're playing tonight?" I said, "Yeah, the Ottawa Bootleggers, I believe they're called, or something like that." I said, "No," he said, "you're playing a lot of pros." He said, "There's 4 or 5 or 6 guys over there that played on TV about 3 weeks ago for the Rough Riders."
Mhm.
Said they're on the Rough Riders taxi squad. Oh, that was great news, right? You're gonna be defending against that. But anyway, make a long story short, we start the game, and he told me this one particular player that we playing over our center was one of their best players over there. So I was watching Albert Brinson was our center when he snapped the ball. Albert at that time probably weighed 250 somewhere, 260 somewhere in there. And when Albert snapped the ball, this guy intentionally got Albert's attention with a forearm under the chops. And Albert, I watched him, did a 360 in the air, laid it flat in his back, almost knocked out, right? So.
And Albert was a big guy.
And Albert was a big guy. Albert gets up. Now Albert is mad, wants to fight. So anyway, there's a little scuffle going on out there. Anyway, Gary Butler sends in a sub to get him off the field before he gets thrown out. So anyway, we get Albert on the sideline and we get him calmed down. And then I told him, I said, "Albert, you're playing against a pro." I said, "This guy is a professional football player." I said, "Do the best job you can against him. And whenever we run a play that's within a hole or two of us, just ask the guard to double team with you. Because we can't let this guy destroy everything we're doing offensively. We got to double team him."
Sure.
So depending on what side the play is going on, double team him. I said, "You're not going to handle that guy one-on-one. There probably isn't anybody, in the stadium can handle that guy one-on-one."
Sure.
So anyway, make a long story short, we win the game. After the game, John Williams and I are walking by their locker room. And John looks in and they're showering. And John turns to me and he says, "Earl, can you believe we beat that team?" And I looked in there and it was just like the New York Giants. I mean, these kids were athletes.
Mhm.
I said, no, I can't believe that we did beat them, John, but we did. We had a running back by the name of Ziegler from the Air Force Base, who I tried to get a Division I scholarship for at the University of Pittsburgh. But anyway, Ziegler had a great game, and a kid by the name of Tommy Wilder, wide receiver. He had a tremendous game up there. And we won the game like 13-6 or 14-7. I don't know if you remember the score. Mike,
We didn't beat them by a lot, but the reason that we beat them is because the guys that they had that were pros made the other guys get benched. So there was animosity on their team where our team was playing together.
Yeah.
Sure.
These guys were individuals. They were great individuals, but they weren't a team.
Sure.
We were a team.
That's why we were able to beat them. We played as a team.
Right.
They played as a bunch of, as individuals, we couldn't match up with them at all.
Right.
They were athletes, really tremendous athletes.
And Albert made it through the game?
And Albert survived.
With double team help.
Double team help.
Did he get flopped again, or was that the one time?
I stopped watching him after that.
You know what soothed him is that comment when you told him no one in the stadium could block him, so don't feel so bad. All right, so we'll talk about in our next segment some of the players that you guys
Yeah, I
helped
would love
coach
to do
that were
that.
on that 1991 team. We're reviewing the inaugural season of the Plattsburgh North Stars, who are celebrating their 25th anniversary season in 2016, but we're looking back at the year 1991 with Earl Brunelle and Mike James, and we'll have more with them when this special presentation for Hometown Cable continues right after this.
And I
Once again, we want to thank the folks at the Comfort Inn for hosting us this afternoon as we're reflecting back on the inaugural season of the Plattsburgh North Stars with Earl Brunelle and Mike James, two of the coaches that were on the original 1991 North Star coaching staff. And in our, what might be our final segment, we'll see what direction we end up going. We'd like to talk about some of the players. We've talked about the coaching staff and the personalities that were on the staff, and we've shared some of the moments that took place over the course of that inaugural season on the field and against some of the different teams. Now let's talk about some of the guys that were actually out on the field playing, and I guess I'll kind of throw it open-ended to you, Mike, and you can take it in
Okay.
whatever direction you'd like to go.
In this segment, I wish that some of the other guys that had different obligations and they couldn't be here, I wish they could be here, because this is where they could go off and talk about their players. And we'll do the best that we can, and I think that we remember most of them, or if not all of them, but I wish they were able to be here to talk about their position groups, because we had some great players, and I want to give them the credit that they deserve. And they were a lot, especially my group. I love working with my group of guys. So I'm going to start with my group, and then I'll mention the other guys, and then we can pick up or tell stories about them, whatever way you guys want to go. But my two defensive ends were Sam Kelly, who was from Texas, and he was an Air Force Base gentleman, and Shannon Manor, who was a local guy who played at Beatmantown. Shannon made the All-Star team. Sam would have made the All-Star team. He got transferred to another Air Force base
In the middle of the season?
in the middle of the season. If he hadn't been transferred to another Air Force base, both of my guys would have made the All-Star team. I had Mike Archer, who later, I had coached Mike in high school. He later switched to offensive tackle, not that year, but the following years, and he made the North Stars Hall of Fame team, I believe. I had Brian Foster and Jason Digman. Brian was from Beatmantown. Jason was from Peru. These were tough kids, and they gave me 100% all the time. My group, I couldn't ask for a better group. They were hard workers. They did everything you asked. They were great to work with. When Sam left, and I guess this is the time to mention this, when Sam left, then Earl and I talked, and that's when I started playing again. I wasn't playing up until that point. And same thing happened with Gary in the secondary, actually. Gary went back to playing as well.
So out of necessity, you can't make a trade in the Empire Football League.
No, you don't make a
can't look
trade.
at the waiver wire and try to find somebody off the waiver wire.
No, so I get...
And you raised your hand.
Well, I get made fun of at work now for being old. Well, at that time I was 32, so for playing football, that's old.
Sure.
So I got made fun of then too, but I did all right.
So you stepped into that position, and some of the names that you mentioned just on that short list, those are guys that have had an impact since their playing days have finished on local football as well. You mentioned the name of Shannon Manor, who,
Right.
of course, coached later on at Beekmantown, and his sons were impact players there as well in high
Good
school.
football players. In fact, one of his sons went on, had a scholarship at the University of Springfield.
Mhm.
Yeah, good football player.
Now, in passing, Shannon was younger than us, but we had a group of guys who used to get together every week and play behind a barn at Sonny Purdette's out in West AZ. And Earl and Gary and Don would just pull their hair out because we played full-blown tackle football and we didn't have any pads. And Shannon was a young guy back then, but he was part of that group.
And the last thing these guys wanted was somebody to show up with a busted ankle.
Yeah.
Oh, no, we did worse than that, unfortunately.
Really?
Yeah, Brian Foster was one of the casualties.
Yeah, we used to lose more kids to injuries on Sunday than we did on Saturday.
Yeah.
But you're supposed to be resting up on Sunday, recovering
No,
from
we
what
were
happened the
out,
day
we were playing
before.
behind
No,
the barn.
not those guys.
We had a lot of fun.
Some competition brings out the best in everybody.
Now, my punt return guys, I had Jimmy Ziegler, who Earl's mentioned a couple of times. He was from Georgia, and unbelievable skills. Unbelievable skills. And then Tommy Wilder was a wide receiver from Michigan, but he played in the punt return as well.
Mhm.
And then the person that I thought in this area was the best punt returner out of this area, Roger Brown. And Roger had played at Beekmantown.
Mhm.
So I had three exceptional athletes as punt returners.
Ziegler was he the feature back?
Yes.
He was the
main
feature
runner.
back.
Yeah, he was.
Well, Blaine Applegate as well.
Right.
But then Applegate had gotten a hernia, so Jimmy became the man,
Right.
and he was unbelievable talent.
And Wilder, if I remember, had been dubbed touchdown.
Yeah,
Touchdown Tommy Wilder was the nickname that he was
yeah,
given.
Yeah, he was a very good player.
Tremendous athlete.
But Roger, when you talk about high knees when guys run, they didn't get any higher. And he was a very exciting player. Every time he touched the ball, the crowd would go crazy. You know.
Yeah, there were some guys on the offensive side of the football that we'll get to who possessed a really high skill set. And again, a lot of those guys were connected to the Air Force Base, and they
Right.
brought in. They had been exposed, it's probably a better way to say it, to a higher level of football in their native state.
Right.
And then the Air Force brings them to Plattsburgh, and they probably think football's done, and then all of a sudden this pops right into their lap, and here's a chance for them to
Right.
play
And the
again.
fact that we had Jimmy Parks on the coaching staff helped
Mhm.
because he drew a lot of these guys out to play.
So he pointed them in the right direction.
Right, absolutely.
One particular kid that we got from the base that was very impressive also was, I forget his first name now, but his last name was Anderson. He was the backup for an All-American quarterback at the Air Force Academy.
Mm,
And they ran the wishbone.
right.
And he was a good quarterback. And then
Yeah.
my future son-in-law, Matt Sames, was his backup.
Hmm.
And we had Sean Roscoe,
Sean Lasco.
and I think either Chance Rambin or Randy Brown in that mix too. I mean, we had some talent. We had a lot of talented players. But we'll get to that. I was going to do the defense first,
Oh,
Earl, and
okay.
then we'll go to the
Sounds
offense.
fine.
That way, otherwise,
Yeah.
I think if we bounce back and forth, we're going to lose.
We'll go all over the
Yeah,
place.
we'll lose
Yeah.
our spot
Okay,
here.
sorry.
And when you're no, and when you're talking about guys, as I mentioned, some of these other names, they're going to be names that you're familiar with as well. Because so Shannon and Sam were the defensive ends. As I said, Shannon made the All-Star team, Sam would have made the All-Star team. Keith Tedford and Bobby Brunelle, his nephew, were the defensive tackles. And Keith was a tremendous athlete
Mhm.
back then, and Bobby was a really big boy. And he was also our backup fullback.
Mm-hmm.
And Keith, I think, had gotten cut from the Buffalo Bills, right?
I know we had a tryout with the pros. Played very well at a college in, was it Kansas or one of those? I know Keith had a good college career.
It wasn't Kansas. I know who it was, and I can't think of the name.
But he did have a pro tryout.
Right.
And eventually worked in Saranac.
Saranac,
right?
became the head coach in Saranac for a number of years.
Football and baseball program he was
Right.
involved with.
Yeah.
And then our nose man, we had Todd Lauren. And we've already mentioned
Mhm.
Todd. And as I said, he would have made the All-Madden team. And when they say looks are deceiving,
There's
That's
an
the case.
example.
Yeah.
because this kid was tough as nails.
He was a lunch pail guy who had a level of nastiness.
Absolutely.
Big area.
We could share stories about that, but we'll do it off the air.
I'll share one story. We're up playing in Montreal,
Okay, yeah, I wasn't gonna go there. Okay.
I'm gonna keep it.
PG. Or G.
Anyway, Todd had a way of getting under the skin of a sinner. Let's put it that way, okay? So anyway, to start the game, Todd does his thing, gets the sinner very, very angry. I'll make a long story short, as the game is going on, it's just not the sinner that's angry with Todd. There's a bunch of them. In fact, there's a play along the sideline right next to us, and Todd is out of bounds by a good 10 yards. This guy never stops running and hits Todd out of bounds about 10 yards outside the
And this is
line
the
of
same
play.
game where Gary got hurt, by the way.
Yeah. But anyway, they go back on the field, and a little while later, my nephew comes running up to me, and he called me Uncle Earl. He says, Uncle Earl, he says, you gotta get Todd Lauren out of there. They're gonna kill him. They're talking about killing him.
Well, when you get that many people angry,
Yeah.
you haven't gone into specifics on what he was doing, but I'm guessing it's kind of a sensitive
Well, let me put it
subject.
this way. He made the football slipperier.
And he may have had a conversation with the quarterback in his ear hole. And we'll leave it at that. So our corners, and again, I apologize that these other guys aren't here because they would do a better job of describing their players. But we had Tommy Wilder one game at a corner, and then we had Robin Vaughn and that young man from St. John's, and then there was a guy named Freddie.
From Vermont. We've
Right.
forgotten his last name. I know he was a quarterback at Winooski High School when he was playing in Vermont, but I just remember his name as Freddie.
And then Craig Allison was the kid from St. John's, and then
Craig Allison? No,
yeah.
Beemantown.
Was he from Beatontown?
Yeah.
Okay, he was from Beatontown. And again, I didn't coach that position, so
Mhm.
I'm doing the best I can. But
We had
Those
another
are the
kid
guys
in
that I
the
remember.
secondary by the name of Steve Doctor.
right, but that's in the safeties. That's when.
You know,
Yeah.
you're going those positions.
Yeah, I'm
but,
just trying to do a
I'm
position.
just thinking secondary.
Because otherwise, Earl, I'm gonna get lost here. Our linebackers, we had two of the toughest guys going, Randy Trombley and Jay Pasalacqua. And these guys were some tough
They were tough
guys. And we played a racquetball tournament one time, and it was Randy Trombley and your friend that held all the weightlifting records there. God, I can picture him. I can't think of his name. But it was those two guys against Al Tripp and I. There was bodies flying everywhere. This is more of a rugby
That was
game
their
than a
competitive
racquetball
nature.
tournament.
I remember Pasalacqua's name called. He had to have been one of the leading tacklers.
Oh my God!
Oh, yeah.
And when this guy hit you, it was brutal.
Yeah.
I know, because when we played them in high school, I made fun of him on a kickoff. And on the next kickoff, I was checking to see how many teeth I had left. He hit me so hard. Yeah, he was All-American, I believe, in college. He was a great player.
I know Jay had a great career at Norwich University.
And he played a number of years for the North Stars.
He was a very tough kid. And then the safeties were Gary Fazette and the Steve Doctor from Vermont. And Steve Doctor was a doctor, as I recall. Isn't he the one that was a doctor?
No, you're thinking of the surgeon. that
Oh,
wanted to
okay.
save his hands. No, Steve Doctor was not a doctor.
Okay.
He just played one on TV.
Well, we had a surgeon in the secondary until they found out that he was doing that, and they were like, no, your hands are too valuable.
But then later on, there wasn't a team when Plattsburgh first started. There wasn't a team, as you mentioned, in Vermont yet.
No.
No.
it wasn't.
And then later on, there was a team in Vermont that a number of former Plattsburgh players went over to play for.
Oh, really?
And I think that was kind of mid '90s, maybe, or closer to
Yeah,
2000,
it was-
where
yeah, it
that
was
started.
later
And there was a
on.
little rivalry that built up. As I think there was
Between
maybe some animosity that led
Huh.
to people going from one side to the other.
See, I didn't
back
know
and
that
forth.
had happened. I was
Yeah.
out west when that happened. And then on the offensive side of the ball, as I recall, our wide receivers were Brian Foster, Tommy Wilder, and Gary Pizzette. And I don't remember who the other folks were. There was a couple kids from St. John's, I believe, right? Wasn't there one of the McGills? That, see, again, if their position coaches were here, I apologize. But, and our center, Al Brinson, we had mentioned
Mhm.
Al, and then the guards were Jerry DeFia and Pete Gilbo. And Jerry went on to coach,
Yep.
and the Gilbos, we know what they do in Mariah, you know.
There's always, no matter the year, there's always a Gilbo.
There's always a
Gilbo.
Absolutely, and Tucker's, I played with Larry Tucker in college, yeah, but the Gilbos for sure, every year.
Mhm.
And they're usually linemen,
Right.
almost always linemen. And then the tackles, we had Paul Beliers and Chris Rao. And Rao owns the insurance company,
Mhm.
the big guy, real big guy.
And his son had a very good
Paul-
career at Beekmantown that
At
just
Beekmantown,
wrapped up a couple of
exactly.
years ago, I think.
Right, he's playing in college
Yes.
somewhere too.
Yeah.
And then our tight end was Roy Ebersol. And I think Roy,
Jay Paris also played tight end
yeah,
for us.
yeah. And I think Roy had a tryout for baseball. I think he had a tryout for the Yankees
Mm.
as a catcher, but I could be wrong about that. But that's how I remember it.
I remember him as playing both at Peru, and then eventually he switched over and played at PHS. He went to PHS. I think he
Oh,
graduated
okay.
from PHS. But
Roy is a good athlete.
He was.
Very good athlete.
there were a number of good athletes in the Ebersol family.
And then our quarterback, this has been a point of discussion for us because our running backs were so good that we had a hard time trying to remember who was playing the quarterback.
Mm-hmm.
And we seem to think it was Anderson,
Anderson was there the first year.
yeah, and at one point or another we had Sean Rasco, Chance Rambin, Randy Brown, and Matt Sains.
Mm-hmm.
These are all quality quarterbacks. They had very good careers, all of them. And
But as you
but
remember, the early offense,
we think it was Anderson.
the early offense was more ground oriented.
Oh, absolutely,
the air.
Yeah.
absolutely. We had some
We
tremendous
had some
running backs.
Right. And you wanted to play to your strength, and
Yeah.
sometimes keeping it simple is keeping it on the ground.
Absolutely. We had Blaine Applegate was the fullback, and he had been a Division I player.
Mm-hmm. And of course, he was the sports director at Channel 5 at the time.
That's right, and he
And that was a jersey number.
right, and he brought in an audience because of that.
Sure.
And I believe he started at Colgate. too,
Was it Colgate?
as a
Okay.
running back.
And then we had Jimmy Ziegler,
Mhm.
who we've talked about, the young man from Georgia.
And they had nicknamed him Zigzag.
Yeah. Yeah,
Because
Ziggy.
he could cut so well.
Yeah, Ziggy, they call him Zigzag. Yeah.
Instant speed.
Yeah.
And then we had Michael LeBear, and then Bobby Brunelle was a backup fullback. And then our kick returners were Jimmy Ziegler and Tommy Wilder. And
And they were always dangerous when they got the football in their hands.
absolutely, those two guys could take it to the house every time. And then we had the one young guy from the Air Force Base. Remember, Earl, when he thought he scored a touchdown? He was about 10 yards short.
Uh-oh.
Do you remember that,
I
Earl?
don't.
He's running with the ball. He thinks he scores a touchdown. So he sits down and he goes like this. And defensive guy comes and
Wipes
smashes
him
the
out.
ball out of his hand. Don't think we didn't give him a little ribbon when
Oh,
he
I'm
came to
sure.
the sidelines.
Sounds like a good television commercial. Somebody get knocked down short of the end zone. The other thing that I remember about a lot of this as well is the attention that the team received, not just with Blaine Applegate, but I remember early on, because it was a novelty at the beginning, and because it was something new, and of course nowadays there's so many options at our fingertips through the internet, and the number of channels that we might have now to watch at home on the television to keep us in our house. But people were looking for something to do, and I think what also helped the North Stars was the fact that games were on the radio, and through local cable access, games were also visible.
Absolutely.
And there was a real connection to the community, not just for those who went to the games, but those that maybe couldn't get to the game could listen to them on the radio or could watch the games on TV.
Well, the other thing, and I don't know if John did this specifically, but because of the way he assembled the staff, you had players from each school that wanted to play because they had played for those coaches before.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, they had their own following. So you had a following from every school. It wasn't just one or two local schools. I mean, there was a following from every group, and then, of course, the base, and then the fact that we had the guys from Vermont. Now, the one thing we didn't mention is we had a couple guys from Montreal as well. Comes to find out, they weren't actually from Montreal. They had been involved in the helicopter shoot down at the reservation.
Uh-oh.
And the best part about this is when the FBI came to tell us that, we let them talk to their position coach, who had been a state trooper. But there was a lot of funny things that happened during the season, and it was a very, very good group of guys.
Well, one of them that was kind of funny. Why don't you tell them the story about how I had to take you out of a game in Scranton, Pennsylvania one night?
We're playing in Scranton, and these guys are good players.
They won the Nationals.
Yeah. That was the playoff game that we referenced earlier, where it was a blowout.
The two guys I'm going up against had just got cut from the pros.
Mm-hmm.
They're big boys, and they're beating the heck out of me. And they keep sending the guy in motion to crack on my knees. They don't need help. They don't need help. And he keeps cracking my knees. And at one point, Earl looks out there, and I'm face to face with the guy. Well, I'm not 6'6", and he is. I'm off the ground. And this kid keeps cracking on my knees, and I came out of the game, and I told Earl, I said, look, if you don't get me out of here, I will never walk again. Enough.
That was the last game.
Yeah, I retired.
That was it. So your last game was the game in Scranton?
Yeah, that was my last game.
And then, and the next year, did you come back and coach?
No, I was gone. I moved out west.
Okay. So the 1 year, the inaugural year, is your year.
That was my year that I played, yeah.
But let me just go back for a second about the cable access. And I think for a lot of people early on, through Calvin and Hometown Cable, and of course Foxy and Goose Gagnon, and I think it'd be a good time to mention them as well, and maybe some of your recollections or interactions with those guys, or just anything that you remember from their work with television at that time. I was often filming the games. I was a lot younger back then, but I was usually behind the camera filming the games when Foxy and Goose were commenting on them.
Yeah, those guys were the voice of the North Stars, and Calvin, putting it on TV, and Fox and Goose, they had a following around the North Country, and with their, knowledge of the sport and their humor and
their personality, that they interjected into every game,
and it just made the game so much better, and a lot of credit goes to those people for, I believe, not only getting us off the ground, but keeping it going.
Yeah, I remember one pregame they showed up with hard hats because it was going to be one of those tough physical games, so they had to be ready, and they wore their hard hats throughout the entire game while they were announcing the game.
A couple other names I'd like to mention that, thinking back over the years, was Mac McCleary.
Yeah, we talked about him in our first segment, but he was with the North Stars for a long time behind the scenes.
Yeah. And Rick Perry.
Mm-hmm.
Rick was very, very helpful to us, doing the things that made the coaching a lot easier. As far as making sure the equipment was in certain places, and the odds and ends that as coaches we didn't have to worry about. Rick would be taking care of them. Then, believe it or not, we had couple of great managers. One was a boy that I had taught at Beavertown, Ernie McClatchy. Ernie now, I believe, is an assistant athletic director at Ithaca College.
No kidding.
Ernie just did a tremendous job for us as a ball boy and equipment manager. Ernie deals with about 145 IQ, so anything you told Ernie, you didn't have to repeat it 4 or 5 times. And Ernie was actually doing things, before you even asked
Right.
him, because he knew a lot about
He
the
anticipated
game.
well.
Yeah, he just was great and helped us a tremendous amount. And I would just like to mention those, those people, because they made coaching easier.
Sure. And of course, early on, the home games were always over at Penfield Park.
Right.
And I remember large crowds, especially through that first season, as people turned out. And again, I think back to some of the rivalries that were created early on with Glens Falls and with the Watertown Red and Black. They were good competitive games.
Well,
And the fact that you were able to do that right out of the box was impressive.
Right, we could compete with them.
Well, you know what I was happy about is it's continued. It may not be the same level, but in some ways maybe it's better because it's the local guys and they're doing what they love to do and they get to do it for a few more years.
Sure.
And Earl will tell you, when we get together, you'll have guys that play baseball, like in your case, or basketball or whatever. But if they play football together, that seems to be the one they gravitate towards and they talk about and they remember. And I don't know if it's because you're also competing with the elements or you're taking the hits or what it is, but that seems to be the one that pulls everybody the closest. And Earl knows, the guys that I played with in college, we're friends to this day. And some of the crazy things we did, and you look back at it and you just, like I said, I love competing against these guys. I love coaching with them. And Gary Pizzette and I were playing a ping pong game. It's going to get competitive. It doesn't matter what you're doing.
Sure.
So
Another player I'd like to mention was Timmy Cynical.
yeah,
Timmy was a real good football player for us. And the thing I think back about Timmy especially was he played, and didn't have very many wins in high school. And it wasn't until he got playing with the North Stars that, he had a few victories under his belt. But what a good person and what a great football player Timmy was.
well, let me just say this. I actually coached him in high school. And even though they weren't winning, he gave you very good effort. And he was a tough kid.
One of the main reasons why we wanted to put this program together is because now 25 years into this, we've talked about a number of folks that have on the coaching staff that have passed on, and some other names that we've mentioned today that have passed on. And you guys and Calvin and myself thought it was important to document and talk about some of the people that were behind the very beginning of a program that is now entering its 25th year.
Right, and I think that's very important because a lot of the guys that are playing today don't know the history of it. But it also gives us a chance to tell them how much we appreciate their continuing it. Because we got it going, they're the ones that kept it going.
Mike, it's hard for them to know the history of it. They weren't born yet.
That's true. Your pants are older than they are.
Well, it's been an interesting program, and we hope everybody
Thank you
at
guys
home
very much.
has enjoyed
It was fun.
the memories of that first season in 1991, and hopefully people will have an appreciation for what people experienced and went through in getting this program off the ground, and when they run into some of the people that we've mentioned or you guys on the street, offer a note of thanks for getting things going, at least for those people that are still involved with the program and are participating with the North Stars now.
Well, it's funny. The one thing that when you were talking about the stadium in Pennsylvania, and one of you guys mentioned about the AstroTurf, and I'm thinking today All these guys have AstroTurf. Every high school, they haven't won a game in 30 years. They have AstroTurf.
And that turf was awful. It's Grand Wilkes-Barre. That turf, if I remember
well, that
well.
was a big deal. And the one in Montreal was worse.
Yeah.
The one in Montreal had creases. You had to be careful you didn't break your fingers. But, you know, for us, that was a big deal.
Yeah.
Today, they just take it for granted.
Yeah, every high school nowadays seems to be putting in a multi-use AstroTurf field for soccer or lacrosse or football, whatever it might be.
But like I said, we tip our hat to the guys that are playing today, and hopefully they appreciate what we did for them to get us started. And we appreciate what you guys did today very much.
Well, we want to once again thank the Comfort Inn for hosting our conversation this afternoon. We want to thank Mike James as well as Earl Brunelle, two of the original members of the 1991 Plattsburgh North Stars coaching staff. Thanks to Calvin Castine and everybody at Hometown Cable for documenting our program this afternoon. We hope you've enjoyed it. We continue to look to encourage you to look for more interesting local programming from Calvin and Hometown Cable. So, on behalf of Mike and